call came at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I've been lying awake anyway, the way I always do when the weather changes and my left knee reminds me I'm 63 years old. My phone lit up the ceiling. I reached for it expecting a spam call, a wrong number, something I could ignore and go back to pretending I might sleep. It was my son. "Mom." That was all he said at first. Just Mom, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old and fell off his bicycle on Clement Street and split his chin open on the curb. I sat up. "I'm here. Talk to me." They changed the locks. His voice cracked. I came home from the site and my key didn't work and Nathaniel's toys were on the porch in a garbage bag and He stopped. I could hear him breathing, trying to hold it together. I don't know what happened. I don't know what I did. I was already out of bed, already reaching for my cardigan, hanging on the chair. "Where are you right now?" "Parking lot of the Walgreens on Birchwood. I didn't know where else to go." "Stay there. I'm 20 minutes away." I found him sitting on the curb next to his truck with Nathaniel asleep across his lap, the little boy's sneakers dangling off his knees, one sock half off. My son is 31 years old and built like his father was, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man people assume doesn't need help. He looked about 12 years old right then. I crouched down in front of him. My knee screamed at me and I ignored it, and I put my hand on the side of his face. "Look at me." He looked. "You did nothing wrong. We're going to figure this out. But right now I need you to carry Nathaniel to my car." What I didn't say was what I already knew the moment I heard his voice. I'd seen this before. Not exactly this. Not my son, not this parking lot, but this shape of thing. I recognized it the way you recognize a storm coming by the particular stillness of the air before it arrives. I'd been watching it build for 2 years, and the only thing that surprised me was that it had taken this long. My son married into a family that had money and knew it. His father-in-law had built a regional contracting business over 30 years, the kind of company that put its name on the side of buildings, that sponsored the Little League and the Christmas parade, and enough civic functions that people confused visibility with virtue. His name was Whitmore, Douglas Whitmore. He had an office with wood paneling and a framed photo behind his desk of himself shaking hands with a state senator, and every time I'd been in that room, I'd noticed he positioned the photo so it was the first thing you saw when you sat across from him. My son had gone to work for him 4 years ago. That part had seemed reasonable at the time. He'd been doing residential renovation work independently, good work, careful work, but the scale was small. Douglas offered him a project manager role overseeing commercial builds. Better pay, benefits, a company truck. My son said yes because he was 27 and in love and trying to build something, and Douglas was his wife's father and it had seemed like family. I'd had a feeling about it even then. Not anything I could name, just a friction I felt when I watched Douglas talk to my son at the dinner table, always slightly past him, always slightly above him, the way you talk to someone you've already decided isn't quite your equal. But my son was happy. My daughter-in-law seemed happy. Nathaniel was born. I kept my feeling to myself. Then 2 years ago, the calls started changing. Small things at first. My son calling to tell me he'd been passed over for a raise he'd been promised. Then that his name had been left off a project proposal he'd spent 3 months developing. Then that Douglas had started CAing his son, a 24-year-old who had never run a job site in his life, on emails where decisions about my son's projects were being made. Then that there was talk of restructuring the management team. Then that my son had overheard Douglas on the phone saying something he couldn't quite make out, but that had included his name and the phrase, "not a fit long term." I listened to each call. I asked careful questions. I said careful things. But after each one, I went to my desk and I wrote it down. Date, detail, context. I've kept records my whole career, 31 years as a contracts administrator for a commercial real estate firm, the last 12 as department head. You learn that memory is a story and paper is evidence. I had a file on Douglas Whitmore before he ever touched a lock. What I didn't fully understand yet was what he was doing with the money. I sat in my kitchen that night with Nathaniel asleep on my couch, and my son across the table from me with his hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from, and I listened to the part he'd been too ashamed to tell me on the phone. His wife, Douglas's daughter, had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. She'd signed papers 2 weeks earlier transferring my son's equity stake in a joint project back to her father's company. A project my son had managed from the ground up, a commercial renovation in the warehouse district that was worth, at completion, considerably more than anyone had told my son when he signed on. She said her dad told her it was a formality, a restructure. She said she didn't think it mattered. I looked at my son. He was trying very hard to believe that. Did she tell you she signed? Long pause. No. I nodded slowly. I picked up my mug. Okay, I said. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sleep in the guest room. Nathaniel stays on the couch. In the morning, I'm going to make eggs and you're going to eat them, and then you're going to call in sick to the site. And you and I are going to sit here and you're going to tell me everything you remember about every project you've worked on for the last 4 years. Every number, every conversation, everything that felt wrong but you couldn't explain. Can you do that? He looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. Mom, what are you going to? Can you do that? He nodded. Good, go to sleep. I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk with my file and my laptop and a yellow legal pad, and I started building something that had a shape to it by the time the sun came up. Here is what I knew from my years in contracts. Money disappears along seams, at the joints between what was agreed and what was documented, between what was promised verbally and what was signed, between what a person understood they were authorizing and what the language actually said. Douglas Whitmore was not a sophisticated fraudster. He was a man who had been slightly dishonest in small ways for 30 years and had never been seriously questioned, and that kind of man always gets lazy. He starts to believe his own accounting. The warehouse district project was the obvious place to start, but it wasn't the only place. My son spent 6 hours at my kitchen table the next day, telling me things he'd been storing up for 2 years without knowing why he was storing them. A subcontractor who'd been double billed on 2 jobs. A materials order that had been invoiced to a city contract, but physically delivered to a private renovation Douglas was doing on a property he owned personally. A change order on a school gymnasium project that had been submitted, approved, and paid, and that my son had never actually authorized, though his name was on it. That last one made me put down my pen. Say that again. He said it again. Your name was on the change order. Yeah, I found out when the client called me to ask about the delay it caused. I'd never seen the document before. Do you still have the client's contact information? Somewhere, yeah. Find it. By the end of that week, I had spoken to 3 people. A forensic accountant I'd worked with 15 years ago who owed me a professional favor, a former colleague who now worked in the county contractor licensing office, and an attorney, not a close friend, but a woman I respected, someone who specialized in contract fraud and employer liability and who listened to everything I laid out and said carefully. This is more than a civil matter. I want to be honest here, I was not calm through all of this. There were nights I sat in my kitchen at midnight too angry to do anything useful, thinking about my son on that Walgreens curb with his child asleep on his lap, about 4 years of his labor and his good faith being used against him, about the particular cruelty of someone letting you believe you're building something for yourself when you're actually building it for them. I thought about my daughter-in-law and what her silence had cost my son, and I had to set that aside deliberately more than once because anger makes you sloppy, and I could not afford to be sloppy. What I focused on was the paper. There is a particular satisfaction, if you are the kind of person I am, in building a case document by document. Each piece connects to the next. A billing discrepancy connects to a contract clause, connects to a licensing requirement, connects to a licensing requirement, connects to a liability. You start to see the shape of it, not as a betrayal, which is what it also was, but as a structure, which is what you can actually do something about. 6 weeks after that 2 a.m. phone call, I drove to Douglas Whitmore's office. I had not called ahead. His assistant told me he was in a meeting. I said, I'll wait. I sat in his lobby for 40 minutes. I had brought a folder, I set it on my lap and looked at the framed photo of the building project on the wall across from me, one of his big commercial jobs. The kind with a sign out front that says a Douglas Whitmore construction project. And I thought about my son walking through job sites at 6 a.m., making sure things were done right. When Douglas finally came out to meet me, he was smiling, the careful smile of a man who has decided in advance that whatever I was here for, he could manage it. We went into his office. He gestured at the chair across from his desk, the one positioned to face the photo of him with the senator. I moved the chair slightly before I sat down. He started talking first. He was sorry about the situation. These things happen in business. He'd always respected my son. There was nothing personal in any of it. I let him finish. Then I opened my folder and I put the first document on his desk. It was the change order, the one with my son's name on it that my son had never seen. Douglas looked at it. The smile stayed on his face, but something behind his eyes shifted. Now, that. I put the second document on top of it, the materials delivery records, then the double billing, then the accounting comparison my forensic contact had prepared, then the 2 sworn statements I had from former subcontractors who'd agreed to talk once I assured them they were not alone. Then the letter from the attorney, which was not yet a lawsuit. It was a notice of intent, carefully worded, that outlined the potential claims and referenced the specific statutes and invited a resolution before the matter was referred to the contractor's licensing board and the county district attorney's office. I folded my hands on top of the folder. Douglas had stopped talking. "I know you're a man who values his reputation in this community," I said. "So I want to give you the opportunity to resolve this quietly. What I'm asking for is straightforward. My son's equity position in the warehouse project restored. Compensation for 4 years of wages below what was represented to him at hiring. I have the original offer letter. A formal severance and release, properly drafted. And a settlement on the unauthorized use of his name on project documentation, which, as I think you know, creates both a civil liability and a licensing issue." Douglas looked at the folder. "This is a lot of, I'm not finished." I kept my voice even. "I'm also going to need your assurance in writing that you will not contact my son's current and prospective employers or clients in any negative capacity. Given what I have here, that's actually the easiest thing I'm asking for." The room was very quiet. He was a man who was used to being the most powerful person in whatever room he was in. I don't think he'd looked at a 63-year-old woman and updated that assumption before he walked out of his meeting. I watched him revise it in real time. It took about 45 seconds. "I'd need to have my attorney look at this." "Of course. I'd expect nothing less. I'm available through my attorney's office. Her contact information is on the letter." I stood up and picked up my folder. "Thank you for your time, Douglas." I walked back through his lobby. I nodded to his assistant. I went to my car and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds of feeling everything I'd been keeping at arm's length for 6 weeks. Then I put the car in drive. The settlement was reached 11 days later. I will not say the number because it's not about the number, but I will say it was sufficient. My son had a meeting with a contractor he'd worked with years ago before Douglas, a man who remembered how my son ran a job site, who had a project manager opening. He started the following month. Nathaniel is 4 now. He has a bedroom in my son's apartment that they painted together, a particular shade of blue that Nathaniel chose himself from the paint chips at the hardware store, holding each one up to the light and taking the decision very seriously, the way small children do when you give them real authority over something. I have a photo of the 2 of them in that room. Nathaniel on my son's shoulders holding a paint roller, both of them covered in blue. I have never told my son the full extent of what was in that folder. He knows I negotiated a settlement. He knows it was more than fair. He asked me once, a few months later, how I'd known what to do. I told him the truth. I said, "I've spent 30 years watching what happens when people don't read what they sign and don't write down what they're told. I wasn't going to let that be your story." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Were you scared?" I thought about the nights in my kitchen. the anger I'd had to set aside, the 40 minutes in that lobby. Yes, I said, but I was more tired of being scared than I was scared. There's a difference. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. What I know is this. There is a certain kind of man who looks at a quiet woman of a certain age and sees someone who will absorb what he gives her and move on. Someone without leverage, without recourse, without the will to be difficult. I have spent my whole life in rooms with that kind of man. I have watched them be surprised, over and over, when the person they underestimated turns out to have been paying attention the whole time. I was paying attention. I have always been paying attention. Nathaniel calls me Grandma Ruth. He says it like it's one word. Grandma Ruth. The way children compress the people they love into something they can carry around with them. He'll be starting kindergarten in the fall, and he's already worried about whether he'll know anyone there. I told him what my mother told me a long time ago in a kitchen not unlike mine, that the bravest thing you can do is walk through a door when you don't know what's on the other side. That the not knowing is the whole point. That you find out who you are by what you do with the not knowing. He thought about it very seriously. Then he asked if we could have waffles. We had waffles. Some things you hold on to with both hands. Some things you fight for with everything you have. And some things, the small, ordinary, irreplaceable ones, you just sit down at the table and receive, and you are grateful, and that is enough. I've thought a lot about what made that night possible. Not the settlement, not the folder, not the 40 minutes sitting in Douglas's lobby, but the 30 years before any of that happened. The habits, the legal pads, the instinct to write things down not because I expected trouble, but because I'd learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that clarity protects people. That vagueness is where harm lives. Douglas didn't set out one morning and decide to steal from my son. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who want a clean villain. What he did was smaller than that and older than that. He made one slightly dishonest decision, and it worked. So he made another. He let a corner go unexamined because examining it would have been inconvenient. He told himself the story that men like him always tell, that he'd earned more than he'd taken, that the people around him were lucky to have his attention, that what looked like exploitation was really just good business. He told that story for 30 years and nobody handed him a reason to question it, until I did. What I want people to understand is that I wasn't extraordinary that night. I was prepared. Those are different things. Preparation is something you build quietly, over time, in the ordinary moments when nothing is happening and it seems like nothing ever will. It's the habit of paying attention when paying attention is boring. It's writing something down when it would be easier not to. It's asking one more question when you're tired and you'd rather just let it go. My son is a good man. He trusted people because that's who he is, and I would not change that about him for anything in the world. But trust without documentation is a vulnerability, and I had spent decades understanding exactly how that vulnerability gets used. I couldn't give him my experience. What I could give him, when the moment came, was what I'd built from it. There's something I keep coming back to about Nathaniel choosing that blue for his bedroom. He held every paint chip up to the light. He took it seriously. He wasn't in a hurry. And I think about that as a kind of model for how to move through hard things, not rushing to a conclusion, not grabbing the first option because you're overwhelmed, but holding each possibility up to the light long enough to actually see it. My son asked me if I was scared. I told him the truth. I was, but I was more tired of being scared than I was scared. That's not courage in any grand sense. It's just what happens when fear has been sitting in the room so long it starts to feel like furniture. At some point you decide you want your room back. What Douglas got wrong, what people like him always get wrong, is the assumption that quiet means powerless, that a woman who doesn't make noise doesn't have anything to say. I have spent my whole life in that assumption's shadow, and I have spent my whole life building something it couldn't see. The paper was always there. I was always there. I was just waiting until it mattered.